know your intro though when you don't want it to end. Oh, but welcome to a different frame. I'm your co-host Anisha,
And I'm Kendra.
And I'm Skadita.
and this is a podcast for the people, by the people. Now, this show is made possible by Alabama Values Progress, a communications hub that's dedicated to breaking the cycle of misinformation during the times where the truth is pretty much hard to find. So, we're delivering facts, data, and receipts on what's happening in Alabama. Now, today's episode is titled You Down with AVP?
Yeah, you know me.
All right, so we're going to dive into today's episode. Kendra, why don't you let everyone know what's on tap today?
Yeah, so everyone, today is our first episode of A Different Frame. And during this episode, we're going to introduce you to Alabama Values Progress. We'll let you know what you can expect from AVP, especially during the redistricting special session. But we'll get to that a little later. And there's no one more suited to tell you more about the organization than our executive director, Anisha Hardy.
Oh, thank you, Kendra. This is so true. Alabama Values Progress is a communications hub. And some of you may be wondering, what is a communications hub? Well, ultimately, we're the civic plug for people on the ground and a sounding board for organizations on the ground working to break down barriers to civic participation, such as voting or redistricting work. We work directly with grassroots and coalitions across the state to increase transparency and accountability. I mean, we also create content and messaging strategies that disrupt the cycle of misinformation and tear down the frames of disinformation, similar to this podcast. Our approach is to leverage the power of culture, visual stories, messaging to amplify voices and values that's advocating for a more inclusive and equitable Alabama. Now, over the past few years, there's been this movement, y'all, building amongst grassroots organizations dedicated specifically to filling the gaps in Alabama's civic and political infrastructure for progress and policy change. Policy change to create, like I mentioned, an equitable and inclusive Alabama. Alabama Values Progress. We are part of that movement. We're part of that collective, and there's power in the collective, right? And speaking of power in the collective and partnerships, one of our co-hosts, Skadita, is a great example of how we all work together in these civic spaces.
Yeah, so I know we've all heard the saying, teamwork makes the dream work.
That yes, it does.
Right, exactly. It doesn't just apply in sports. It applies in any community engagement, civic engagement, social justice work. And it's the most important part because there isn't any social movement or social cause that was done by one person. It's always been a collective, i.e. this podcast. There's three of us. We're a collective. So we're all coming together so that people can be a part of the conversation because they most certainly deserve to be a part of the conversation. My start in this political civic engagement space was when I was 13. My father was sentenced 60 years in prison for a drug charge. And at the time, I knew that 60 years wasn't right because I knew that murderers didn't even get that. And I had a sense of understanding of how the system worked. And so that following year, I got the opportunity to page at the Alabama House of Representatives. And at the time, when my mom first asked me about it, I was like, oh, I get to skip school for a week. I'll do it. But once I got there and I realized who I was around, where I was, and how that they could help me, I kind of started to change my perspective. And so I paged up there up until I was 20, 21, and I really up until I couldn't anymore. But I spoke to senators, representatives, parole board members, lobbyists, and really everybody else that would listen to what had happened to my father, and I was just advocating for him. So in 2016, my father's parole board hearing came up and he was released. Yeah, so after that, I applied for a job. I applied for an internship at the Alabama House of Representatives, but they offered me a job. And so I worked there for 3 sessions. And after I left, I started going into campaign work, advocacy work, grassroots organizing, mainly because of my experience there. I understood how the system worked better than I ever understood it before because I had worked there for so long. At least it felt long.
So you skipped. You thought you were skipping school, and you ended up getting school. That's what happened.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah. And so I just wanted to put people on to the information that they didn't know. Like if people knew how absurd and like crazy, people, the elected officials that they voted for, the things that they would say and do, they would have a totally different perspective. So I just wanted to have a place to where I could just tell people how it really works. And so fast forward to now, I'm currently the data and training manager for Alabama Forward, and I love it. So
yeah. Shout out to Alabama Forward, doing some great, they're the state civic table, doing some great work on the ground. Their table members doing some great work on the ground. Shout out to shakethefield.org. Those of you that are trying to figure out how to plug in, how to find your space, how to get involved, shakethefield.org is a great resource for that, to connect you. And then also Alabama Election Protection Network, a great organization also, especially during the redistricting cycle. And I think their site is voteprotection.org. Like if you're really trying to get information and also tap in and get involved.
Yeah, so being in this space is great because we can make a difference in the lives of so many people. And thinking back to my newspaper career, that's really what inspired me to really get involved in these civic spaces, because during that time I got to talk to so many people who experienced disparities in their communities, and these issues were really holding them back. One of the stories that kind of sticks out in my mind was a mom from Opp, and she lived in public housing, had 3 sons, and she decided one day that she wanted to teach them about responsibility. And, she didn't really have an education, so she went to work at a local fast food establishment. And of course, she was making very little money doing that, but she wound up losing some of her food stamp money, and her rent increased to this amount that really wasn't feasible for her to pay. So she had no choice but to quit her job to make it work, which is really sad. So she told me that she felt like she was just stuck in this rut and that she couldn't get out of it. So that really, really, resonated with me. And then another thing that sticks out in my mind is Leons County. I worked there for a while, and the residents there, they forever have been a motivating factor for me. In my need to be in these civic spaces and fight for change, because, there's so many amazing people that live in that county, but they are living in one of the poorest counties in America, and their stories, they've just forever touched me and fueled my passion and my courage to fight for this change in the state. And of course, we all know that Alabama desperately needs to become a state that embraces all of its people. Working at AVP is really giving me, the opportunity to help amplify work of the grassroots organizations like Alabama Forward, where Skadita works. And, they're the ones that are working super duper hard to make Alabama a better place to be.
Yeah. I agree, Kendra. I've always been involved in marketing and branding and content creation for over a decade now, just working with nonprofits and for-profits, also serving as a professor in the areas of comms, mass media and society, media ethics. But however, the pivotal point for me was in 2020, all of the social unrest and injustice that just was so prevalent, in the news. It was a lot. I think I'm suffering from PTSD. That was
2020
a lot.
was a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mind you, definitely hyper aware of, the things that were going on in 2020, that it's not unique to our country's history, but I just became hypersensitive to it in 2020. And, I asked myself, okay, Anisha, what are you doing? What are you doing to help bring about this change? The change that you want to see. And, and I told myself, okay, it's time for me to get out of the classroom. I want to leave academia. I want to be on the ground with the people. I was just ignited to action. And it was just very important to me to utilize my skills in civic engagement, communications, and research in a manner that directly amplified the voices and increased the power of marginalized and disenfranchised communities. It was so vital to me to just be in a space, y'all, that was dedicated to eradicating or addressing issues that plague Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and ultimately that threaten our democracy.
Yeah, those issues that do plague these communities, as well as threaten our democracy, like you said, is redistricting. And that's what the next few episodes of this podcast is about. If you want to know the who, what, and when of redistricting, then you are definitely in the right spot.
You're right, Skadita. Redistricting is connected to so many issues, and that is definitely why, and especially we're ahead of the special sessions, and we're going to focus on just making sure that the community know what's going on. But now for our listeners who are wondering, what are we talking about? Like, what is redistricting? What special session? Don't worry, we got you covered.
We got you covered.
Yeah, we got you covered.
Sure.
We're gonna help you out. So Kendra, for those viewers, and listeners that are like, okay, what are y'all talking about? So why don't you take them, let's go down memory lane. Let's just catch them up to speed. Why don't you take a moment and do that?
Yeah, so to do that, we're going to have to take it back. And by that, I mean like way back to 1901. And that's the year that it's way back. So that's the year that the Constitution of Alabama that we're currently under was passed. And in that, it was mandated that the legislature redistrict every 10 years.
Yeah, and so for those who don't know, redistricting is a process that happens every 10 years, and it happens right after we take the census, because you have to take that census data and give it to the reapportionment committee, and that data is what helps us redistrict our cities, school boards, and states. And why do we redistrict though? Because these are the same lines that determine who represents you and your community.
Yeah, so even though it's super important, the legislature couldn't even manage to follow its own rules and redistrict. In fact, they didn't really redistrict for decades, and then when they did, most of the maps they drew, they ended up in some sort of litigation.
But who's really surprised by that? Like, are we really surprised by that? I mean, this is the state with the same constitution that was made to disenfranchise Black folks. I mean, it's 2021 and Alabama is just now coming around to removing racist language from its constitution. So
yeah, and that was in November of 2019 when we had to make that vote on that amendment. Yeah. 2 years ago. Yeah. Just now.
So pretty much they were like, bubble in or circle yes or no if you want to be racist.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I circled no. I don't know about y'all, but I circled.
I don't want to be racist.
Sure. Okay, y'all. So let's skip ahead to 1940. In 1940, the governor was kind of like tired of them not redistricting, so he told the legislature, hey, if you don't redistrict, then I'm going to make a committee that consists of myself, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General. And guess what? The legislature still didn't redistrict, and the governor didn't do anything about it. How is that for accountability?
Yeah, so just empty threats, right? Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so crazy. Yeah, and then another crazy fact is that despite the fact that the legislature had not actually redistricted before, they thought for some reason they needed a committee to study redistricting in 1950.
See, I'm starting to notice a trend with these committees because was something actually done?
No. The committee that they formed recommended that they delay action until the state got its results in 1950. So after they got those results, they were like, they attempted to redistrict in 1956 and 1959, and surprise, both of those were unsuccessful attempts.
Wow.
So fast forward to 1961. And 14 Birmingham residents, actually, they were like, nope, we've had enough. And they filed a class action suit asking that the legislators be elected at large until they could, get with the program and follow the Constitution.
See, shout out to the 14 Birmingham residents. That's what I'm talking about. The power of the collective, coming together, standing up for your community. And I mean, what was the result of that, Kendra?
Yeah, so this is really a prime example of why you should stand up, because what happened was the federal courts ruled in favor of the residents and told the state of Alabama, you must redistrict by a certain deadline or the court was going to do it for them. So what happened was they called a special session like the one we're about to have. They passed 2 bills and they were done. But in less than a week, the court had voided those plans and they ordered the state to use the court's plan immediately. I don't know about y'all, but this is just exhausting. And
yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is.
And how many tax dollars have been spent just because the legislature couldn't play by the rules or didn't redistrict properly? And y'all, special sessions are expensive. It costs like $400,000 to have a special session, which is absolutely crazy.
And of my money, taxpayers' money. I mean, my money. Yeah, no, they better get these lines right.
Yeah, I don't know about y'all, but I'm paying attention to my money, and I want to know where it goes. So thank you, Kendra, for telling me how much it costs.
I could think of so many ways that the state can use that money, education, healthcare. I mean, so many ways.
Infrastructure, so many ways, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically every single time there's been a redistricting attempt, there's been something ruled wrong with it.
Yeah. So some of you may be wondering, okay, thank you, Kendra, for that walkthrough. Now, how can I tap in and get involved in this process? Now that I have an understanding of what it is and in Alabama's history around redistricting. And then there may be some of you that may be saying, okay, well, I just still don't see why I should, care about this. Redistricting is connected to so many core community issues. Because it happens once in every 10 years, oftentimes redistricting is only talked about once in every 10 years, right? But it is it's connected to so many issues that we deal with year round. For example, education. Like redistricting is connected to education.
Yeah, and education, racial gerrymandering is probably many of the multiple reasons why Alabama schools are failing. And what controls that? Redistricting. And if we look at, say, school board map, we can see that these lines that are drawn aren't really making sense. And the way that you draw these lines can uphold segregation by keeping low-income students out, which is bad for economic growth. Let's talk about District 1 and District 2. District 1 consists of Butler, Conecuh, Covington, Escambia, Crenshaw, Baldwin, and Mobile counties. And District 2 consists of Cleburne, Clay, Randolph, Tallapoosa, Chambers, Lee, Russell, Barber, Coffee, Dale, Henry, Geneva, and Houston counties. But if you look at the map, there's no reason why they should be drawn this way. Given the demographics of the state, plus the way that they drew these lines for these districts, is most certainly racial gerrymandering.
Yeah, no, that map doesn't make any sense. But redistricting is also another core issue that we all should care about. Redistricting is also connected to healthcare, right?
Yeah, so many people may not even realize that 17 hospitals have closed in Alabama since 2010.
17?
Yes, 17 hospitals.
Wow.
And not to mention the fact that there are many more hospitals that are daily at risk of closing. Like just last year in Crenshaw County at Crenshaw Community Hospital, which by the way is the only hospital in Crenshaw County, it was at risk of closing. And for Crenshaw Countyans, that means that the average person in the county would have to drive around 30 minutes to the nearest hospital if they needed to seek care.
Okay, wait. So if it had closed, so pretty much if I was at home taking care of, an elderly relative, and they started complaining about chest pains, and I looked over and saw that they noticeably, they need emergency attention. So I would have to hop in the car and drive 25 to 30 miles to the nearest hospital.
That's correct. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, as horrible and morbid as it sounds, there's a huge chance that your loved one might not even make it to the hospital alive.
Yeah. Come on, Alabama. We have to do better. Alabama.
We got to do a lot better than what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And y'all, and when you compare how far a lot of Alabamians have to travel just for hospital care or even to the doctor, it can be 30 minutes to even longer. If you compare that to what the average rural American has to travel, they only travel about 10 and a half miles to the nearest hospital. So we have to travel a whole lot farther. So it's really not a good situation. But anyway, and even 7 Alabama counties do not have hospitals at all. Lowndes County is a prime example of that. And if you think back to 2019, when their sheriff was shot and killed, it could have possibly saved his life if there was a hospital in the county, because it's probably 25 or 30 minutes for them to get to the nearest hospital, which is really sad when you think about it.
Yeah. No, that's sad. That is sad.
Yeah. And then when you think about the fact that 9.7% of Alabamians are uninsured, and Alabama is still one of the states that refuses to expand Medicaid, which could help with this number of uninsured people.
Right. And it's kind of crazy because it's they refuse it, even though 70% of Alabamians agree with Medicaid expansion.
I'm part of that 70%.
Me too. The Medicaid expansion, it will really empower Alabama, and it will be a huge investment, because it would bring so many jobs. So it will provide 14,000 healthcare jobs, 8,200 of those being healthcare businesses, 3,200 of those being healthcare retail, 2,100 being construction for these retail properties, and 800 of them financial healthcare jobs.
It sounds like a win-win, right? I'm trying to understand why we're not taking that deal. What?
Right, you
Sounds like
would
a
think,
win.
right? Right.
Yeah.
But and then the other part of that is the amount of money Alabama has spent giving towards other states is absolutely ridiculous. And since 2014, Alabama has spent $4 billion of our taxpayer dollars to DC and 168 million to Kentucky alone. So we've technically been paying for Medicaid expansion. We just don't get any of those benefits.
So
Whoa.
we're gonna back it up. We're just not gonna skirt through like you just didn't say that we're spending 168 million in another state,
Yeah,
Kentucky,
to
to
their
pay for.
Medicaid expansion, and we don't even have any.
Okay, I just need to just let that. Okay, that's a lot. Yeah,
Y'all, wow.
we have to do better. I stick
You
to
have
that.
to do
We
better.
got to do better, Alabama. Yeah,
See, when you
Oh,
know
yeah.
better, you do better, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And considering that access to healthcare is so important to the quality of life, you would think that our state would make that a priority. And I'm sure everyone wants their family to have access to the best healthcare, or at least if there's an emergency situation, have access to a nearby
Yeah.
hospital.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, definitely.
And not having access to healthcare resources is directly related to redistricting because elected officials make decisions on where the funding goes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and speaking of elected officials, how do they get elected? Voting. Redistricting is connected to
Yeah.
voting also.
It is, and the lines control who you vote for. Changing the lines can change the voter, it can change the elected official, and it can even change the political landscape of what that district is. And based on the history shown to us in terms of Alabama and its past, and even right now, they've purposely drawn them in ways to dilute minority votes by three things. Cracking is the first one. And cracking is splitting the opposing party's voters into many different districts. And then the second one is packing, and that's packing as many voters as possible of an opposing parties into one district. And then last but not least, racial gerrymandering. And it's a process in which district lines are drawn to prevent racial minorities from electing their preferred candidates.
Yeah. So, I mean, also community resources. Redistricting is also connected to the resources that we might not think about every day, in terms of having representation for or advocating for.
Yeah, and some of those things are like, freshly paved streets. And, we all complain about having bumpy roads that make you feel like your car is going to fall apart. And we've even experienced that huge pothole that seems to never get fixed that, might be big enough to swallow your car. And then other things like, sewer services or even water services and landfills. Those are all important things that are affected by redistricting. And even things like no sidewalks and parks and literally so many more things that you can associate with your quality of life, they're dependent upon redistricting because these things require funding, and it's funding that isn't necessarily readily available at your city government or your county government, and those entities rely on the federal government and the state government to help them get those resources. And if you really think about the cities and towns that are thriving and are getting all these nice new amenities that we all want, they have representatives who are fighting for them to get that. So if you think about it, if your city or town isn't getting nice new things, it's probably because your representative is not fighting hard enough for you. That's why it's so crucial to have someone represent your area who not only knows your area, but also cares about your area.
Yes, Kendra, you make a great point. I mean, and most importantly, redistricting is connected to representation. When you talk about having someone that that represents you and that understands the needs of your area and cares about it and advocates for those needs, representation matters. Right now in Alabama, white officials can pass a law without one single black vote. Now, before you diminish this concern to the desire to just get rid of white elected officials, it is so much deeper than that. It's not that. It's about, but it's about having representation that reflects Alabama constituents in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, social economic status, background. The legislative body, think about it, you all. Their most important function as lawmakers is writing, supporting, and passing bills that do what? That address the constituents' interests. I mean,
Yeah,
representation
I
matters.
agree. The bottom line is Alabama has to do better. Like, our legislators have to learn that they work for all Alabamians, not just white
Yes.
people. And they're still playing the same tactics that they've been using for years, and that just doesn't work anymore for Alabamians.
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. Oh, Kendra, when you make that point, it makes me think of the public testimony that was given by Richard Jackson, where he was just talking about like how he wasn't going to deal with this anymore. And I think we have that clip. Let's play that clip.
I'm just saying this, you can bury your head in the sand and act like it's not real. But there's a generation that's coming along like you've never seen before. And they're not going to stand for this. I'm not going to stand for it. I'll be 70 years old. And I'd just be damned if I go to my grave with the things that I put up with as a 12-year-old that I'm still putting up with.
Wow.
See,
That's real.
I stand with Mr. Jackson.
Right.
Do you stand with Mr. Jackson?
I stand 10 toes down with him.
Yeah, I stand with Mr. Jackson. Like when I first saw that testimony, I was like, oh my gosh, like it broke my heart because I thought about what he said. He said, as a 12-year-old and he's 70 now, and he was like, I'm not going to go to my grave dealing with the same stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, how many redistricting cycles has he been, has he been through? Has he been impacted by? And that's a lot. Like, and he was just saying, look, there's a generation that's not going to stand for this. And so just pretty much calling them out. He's saying, look, you all have been using the same tactics since I was 12. So, like I said, I stand with Mr. Jackson. Like, it has to change. Like, it is time it's just time for a change. Well into the 20th century, white men constitute an overwhelming majority of the voting population, where African Americans were routinely deprived of the opportunity to participate in democracy because of that. And then, Hispanics and other minority groups, they were fairly insignificant in numbers and excluded by some states, But then in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, you have, where African American representation began to grow and begin to enter in Congress in increasing numbers in 1971 to better represent the interests of the African American community. Representatives, founded the Congressional Black Caucus. So, shout out to that.
Let's take it back in terms of Alabama. Let's go back to Montgomery in the 1800s. Well, before Reconstruction, there was a Black senator named James Rapierre, but due to it being a redistricting year in the city of Montgomery, they drew the neighborhood that he was representing out of his district.
See what I'm saying? Same tactics.
Same tactics.
They better get these lines right.
Right.
We deserve, Alabama deserves fair maps.
We do.
Yeah.
Right. But here's the kicker of that though. That was in 1867 and his term ended in 1872. So it was the last time we ever saw a Black senator before Reconstruction for a while. And in fact, it wasn't until 1970 when Attorney Fred Gray and Thomas Reed were elected, and they were the first two Black legislators since Reconstruction.
Oh, hold on, Skadita. So you're saying that for almost 100 years, we didn't have Black representation in this state?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And my math ain't too good, but 98 years.
Well, that is absolutely ridiculous. That is insane.
That is ridiculous. And that's why to my next point, in terms of Alabama, the census data has shown that we have become more diverse in our demographics, which was the case across much of the U.S. But, in Alabama, the most, increase we have seen has been among people of color. I mean, now Alabama, remains very much a white majority state at 69.1%, and African Americans constitute the largest minority group at 26.8%. So
but out of that 26.8%, Black people constitute 43%. 43% of them are in jail and 54% are in prison. Now let's not talk about the prison gerrymandering that's going on when it comes to redistricting, which basically prison gerrymandering is when they draw their districts around large prisons and then pretend that the inmates are legitimate constituents.
So their body counts, but their vote doesn't.
Their vote does not.
Mm-hmm. We're definitely gonna dive into that during this But so African Americans constitute the largest minority group at 26.8%, and then Hispanics are at 4.6%, Asians at 1.5%, and Native Americans at 0.7%. So it is time that the lines be drawn in a way to allow people to elect officials reflective of their communities. Like, it's past that time. So again, we're demanding fair maps. Like, Alabama deserves fair maps. Now, if you're listening or watching, you may be wondering, how can you stay connected and get involved and stay informed through the redistricting process in this cycle? Definitely tune in to future A Different Frame episodes. The podcast is streaming on all platforms, and you can catch the video version, the podcast of the recording on social media platforms and our website. So like, follow, subscribe, and share to just stay connected and get the latest news and updates regarding the special sessions, and connect with our partner organizations on the ground that are fighting for fair map.
Yeah, so join us next time on A Different Frame for episode 2, The People Spoke, but did they listen? We'll be joined by a special guest to discuss the public hearings and what community members of interest said, shared, and requested for the 2021 redistricting cycle.
All right.